Hey there, welcome back to Relationship Talks. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more spicy stories. Now, let's get into today's story video. She cheated on me with the guy that I thought was her cousin. This occurred in 1998, give or take a year. I was approximately 22 years old at the time and had been dating this lady for about 1.5 years. I was smitten by her because she was stunningly beautiful, intelligent, and humorous. She was just a year my junior, but she still lived with her father, who was quite strict. Even though she was 21, he imposed a slew of restrictions on her, including curfews. Surprisingly, he assumed she was a virgin, despite the fact that I wasn't even her first. When he realized we were having sex, he informed her she couldn't see me anymore. We continued to date, but it was increasingly difficult since she was always sneaking about. She'd often use her cousin as a pretext to get to me, but she regularly stopped at his house for a lawn to have a cover story. She said that they had been close since they were children, so this was natural. I eventually discovered that her cousin was not, in fact, her cousin. He was her father's closest friend's son, but according to her, she always called him cousin and thought of him as a cousin. I began to notice more and more things that appeared out of the ordinary, and I became really suspicious. She informed me one day that she was going to have lunch at a specific place and would then come over. Soon later, I received a message on my pager instructing me to meet at Red Lobster at 12 p.m. Then I received another message informing me that the communication was intended for her father. I dashed over to the restaurant, located her vehicle, and parked a long distance back. Another vehicle arrives, her relative gets out, and they embrace and kiss before heading inside. I returned home to wallow in my pity. I canceled our date on that day, but I didn't notify her. I quickly devised my terrible scheme. I must inform you of any event that occurred earlier in our connection. When she was getting ready one day, I took a Polaroid of her buttocks. It was just a close-up of her buttocks, and there was no way to identify her from the image. I didn't believe she'd give a damn. She became enraged. I've never seen her that enraged before. She was prepared to battle for that photograph, but I made every attempt to keep it away from her. She tried to tear it, but she couldn't. I told her to give it to me and I'd chop it up. She takes out a pen and begins marking it, then finds scissors and cuts it up. I set fire to the remnants in front of her. She remained enraged for some time and lectured me on how she did not want any naked images of herself to ever exist. I can't express how much she despised the notion of anybody possessing nudes of her. She was astounded. She didn't speak to me for almost a week, and we were on the verge of breaking up, but she eventually accepted that I didn't believe it would have affected her and that I would never attempt it again. Now, let's go on. I had my plan in place, and we had made preparations for her to come to my house. I shared a nice home with my closest buddy, yet I lived like a bachelor. My room featured just a bed, a computer table with a chair, a dresser, and an alarm clock on the floor next to my bed. I went to the kitchen and retrieved an additional chair to put at the foot of my bed. I went out and acquired another alarm clock, which I placed on the chair. I wanted it to seem blatantly out of place. We asked after she came over. I maintained my calm and continued having S2-3 times each week for another 2 weeks or so. I made a point of trying various postures and keeping her tilted such that the alarm clock was gazing straight at her. I wanted to keep going, but I felt it was time to call it quits. On the final day, I disconnected the clock, placed it next to my computer, and moved the chair to a different room. I made sure she saw me, but I pretended to be cleaning up. Because I understood how cruel my plan was, I began to have second thoughts about it. I chose to wait a day, which grew into 2, and then I decided to call and confront her after approximately a week. I wasn't sure whether I was going to exact my vengeance or not. I called her and informed her I knew she was meeting her cousin. His name escapes me. She denied it, but I informed her that someone had told me they had seen them kissing. She eventually accepted it, but claimed it had just begun this week. I said, "How can you have your cousin?" She said, "You know, he's not my cousin." We dispute some more, and I tell her I've known her for a month. Then she attempted to blame me for not saying anything when she found out, and she made a pretty smart statement that I can't recall. I then informed her that there was one more thing she needed to know. "Me? Do you recall the alarm clock that was sitting on the chair next to my bed?" "Yes," she says. "Me? Have you ever pondered why it was there?" No, not at all." "Me? Remember how we did doggy at the foot of the bed, cowgirl with you facing the foot, and so forth? The past few times we had S? What the heck are you talking about?" "Me? It was a F-spy camera, you filthy, disgusting F-cheating BTCH. I smashed the phone on the ground. For whatever reason, I dialed from a pay phone. For the following few hours, my pager blew up. It didn't stop vibrating for 30 minutes after I switched it back on. My phone at home was inundated with voicemails. Her texts began with screams and tears, then threats, then pleading, then proposing bribes, and then she would repeat the pattern. She returned to my home the following day and pounded on the door for at least an hour, but I didn't respond. Even though the frequency had dropped significantly, the calls and texts continued to come in for weeks. She also came to my house a couple more times, but I never opened the door and was occasionally not there. I eventually answered the phone, but when she asked for the recordings, I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. I listened to her beg, scream, and plead and finally chimed in with, "I'm not sure what cassettes you're talking about." I hung up the phone and never talked to her again. The phone calls and texts gradually ceased, and I went about my business. There was never a concealed camera, although she is unaware of this to this day. It was simply an old radio alarm clock that looked clunky enough to pass for a spy camera if you weren't looking. I came to regret it since it must have tormented her for a long time, but it just took me approximately 6 months to recover from my shattered heart. Story 2. Married for 19 years before my wife cheated on me. This is my first visit to Reddit. I'll be 75 in July, and I've seen a lot. To be honest, I wanted to share my tale with the younger generation before I died. Because I have lung cancer and don't expect to live much longer, this information has to go out there. In 1964, I was 18 years old when I married. It's as though I'm no longer the same person. I used to be in excellent physical condition, but now I'm confined to a wheelchair. My wife and I had to work full-time since I didn't have enough money to support both of us. She cleaned hotel rooms while I worked on construction. We never had children and yet had time to ourselves on weekends. I don't believe we ever fought, but it's been so long that I'm forgetting, and we didn't have any problems getting along. I began to generate more money over time, and she was able to leave her work and remain at home. I would work longer nights, however, and our marriage honestly deteriorated into a friendship. We seldom had sex, and although I still loved her, I felt something was missing. We didn't spend nearly enough time together in the end. I accept responsibility for taking us down the wrong path with my employment. As you will see later, this was not the only problem, but I should have corrected it while I still had the opportunity. When I go home from work one night, everything seems to be usual. Dinner was served, and the TV was on to baseball, which used to be my favorite sport. I chatted to her briefly in the kitchen before going to my room to change out of my work clothes. When I walked in, I saw a box of condoms on my nightstand. I began to worry since I had a vasectomy years ago and had never used condoms. I quickly questioned my wife about them, and she was unable to come up with an answer in time. She burst into tears and confessed to the infidelity. She brought a coworker over for while I was away and apparently failed to dispose of the condoms. I'm not embarrassed to confess that I, too, was moved to tears after hearing that. When I asked her why she did this, she replied she wasn't attracted to me, was lonely, and didn't like our I couldn't think of anything to say and ended up leaving. We divorced after 19 years of marriage. I was a catastrophe in my 40s. I had lost all hope and tried to continue. I began drinking and gradually developed into an alcoholic. It took me until I was in my 60s to break this habit. I couldn't look in the mirror and see myself as a failure of a guy. I wanted to date again, but I was afraid that the same thing might happen. It never occurred to me that I was awful in bed, and I had no good responses. My skin began to wrinkle a little, particularly on the back of my legs, but I took care in keeping my figure for a long, and I swore she loved it when I had throughout our marriage. I preserved my tough man persona into my 30s, and I still wore my bandana during which she found appealing. I was a generous person who always went down on her when she asked. I utilized cock rings to keep erections going and could always climax extra hard, which was a fetish of hers. I couldn't do anything else if I tried my hardest. However, as time passed, I began to consider the thought that wasn't all that vital at an older age, and I began dating again approximately 5 years ago. We don't have an active life, but she assured me that nothing was wrong with me. I remarried last year, which made me very happy, but sadly, it was also the time when I was diagnosed with cancer. I've lost a lot of energy since then, and my new wife is the only one who keeps me going. We're attempting chemotherapy, but the outlook is grim. In my final days, I'd want to contribute some of the information I've gained over the years in order to make the world a better place. My mental faculties are also deteriorating, therefore I need to act quickly. I hope everyone who reads this can take something from me to make their lives better.